We're glad to have you. My name is Benji, one of the pastors around here at Journey. It's an honor to have you worshiping with us this morning. If you're a guest, we want to say welcome. We hope that you feel at home here with us. It's an honor to have you. We want to welcome those who are watching online as well, and thank you for joining in with us as we worship together. We've been in a series for the past few weeks called Say Yes. Look to somebody beside you and say, you need to say yes. Go ahead, tell them. You need to say yes to what it is that God calls us to respond to the things that He asks us to do, and we need to be willing to respond in a way to say yes. We're excited over the next few weeks. Last week I was in Douglas over there preaching, and Pastor Ronnie was here preaching. This morning he's actually in Douglas. We are getting ready at Easter to launch. We've got between 20 and 30 that are worshiping over at our Douglas campus, and so we're excited to make preparations for that. A couple of announcements for you. March the 7th and March the 21st on Wednesday nights this coming month, March the 7th and 21st. If you're interested in serving over that campus in any form, any capacity, we're going to have meetings over there on campus on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock, March the 7th and the 21st, looking for people that would like to help serve in different areas from worship to all the way from serving as a greeter to the coffee to the children. We have a lot of areas to make preparations for in that community. And then also be in prayer for our network churches in Homerville as well as in Lakeland. And as we make preparations for Easter and getting all of our churches connected in those communities to share the gospel. And so we're excited about that. But I want to continue at saying yes, what it means to say yes to the next generation. And this message is a little different. It's what we're going to do. If you like basketball, we're basically setting up the alley-oop. Like, you know, someone tosses the ball up and then someone else is going to grab it and do what? They're going to slam it, right? They're going to dunk it. So this is kind of setting up for the next couple of weeks and what we're going to be talking about. So some of you may say, well, this is irrelevant to me because I'm not a parent or I'm past that stage. But I'm telling you, this is more than just saying next to the next generation as a parent, but also as a grandparent. Maybe you're here and you're a college student or in high school. One day you look forward to having a family. This involves you, and even in your home right now. And it also involves those of you who are leaders in the community with your businesses and being prepared for the next generation to pass that business on. And so we're going to talk about what that means. And so the question is this. Let's start with asking a question. What happens when your life is finished? What happens when you take your last breath? You say, well, I'm going to spend eternity somewhere. If you're a Christ follower, we know that to be heaven. But I want to take a moment and talk about earth here. What happens when your life is finished? What carries on when you're gone? What continues? It's an important question to ask. Most people don't like to talk about death. In fact, sometimes around the house, I'll be like, Brittany, look, you need to know this. If something ever happens to me, like, you know, with our insurance, life insurance, this is our account, our savings, this is, all these policies, you need to know all of this. And Brittany will be like, I don't want to talk about that. Nothing's going to happen. Don't talk about that, right? We don't like talking about it. But if you look at research, 1 out of 1 is going to die. All right? And pretty much all of us in here, at some point or another, research proves to be true that 1 out of 1, at some point or another, we're going to leave this earth. All right? Nobody lives forever. We're going to take our last breath. And so we need to make preparations for those things. Dealing with funerals. Over the past several years, working with families who've lost loved ones, whether it's a grandparent or a mom or a dad or a sibling or a child. And you have different responses. I've even been into homes where people have been sick on their deathbed and having conversations asking them, hey, what do you want to be remembered by? What would you like for me to share at your funeral? What do you want to be said? What's been most valuable about your life? What do you want to carry on? Very important questions a lot of us don't have a tendency to address. Many of us don't have the opportunity at the end of our life to give those kind of speeches or conversations or have that. And so the question is, what happens? What carries on? What stories will go on? I think about this week with Billy Graham, who passed away. an evangelist who's reached thousands of people and thousands. And a lot of lives changed through that, right? How many of you, let me ask you a question. How many of you ever got an opportunity to see him preach live? Raise your hand. Anybody in here? All right, a couple of us, right? I'll never forget the time that I actually got to see him preach was in Jacksonville at the football stadium. And my papa was down there. And the reason I'll never forget it is I was a young teenager. And when we left and got back to the car, when he got back to his vehicle, he could not find his keys. In fact, he realized that they had fell out of his pocket somewhere on that football field. And so we had no way to get home. And so it was a very interesting thing to try to get home with no keys to get in your car to be able to make it back. And then the next day, Papa was like, yeah, there'll be probably some football players playing on that. They'll be playing on that, and they'll end up tripping over it and finding them or something. But luckily, the next morning he called and was able to get a hold of somebody. I was like, yeah, we found them on the field when we were cleaning up, and you can come get them, get your car. So we were able to work that up. But I'll never forget that. But I share that story with him because we think, now what will carry on now that he's finished and he's in heaven? His life continues here with his stories, right? And you and I have that same platform. You say, I don't have a platform. You have a platform with your kids. You have a platform with your grandkids. You have a platform where you work. You have a platform in your neighborhood. You have a platform with those around you. And what is carried on when you're finished? For the most part, many times not a whole lot carries on. We don't make preparation for it. Today, millions of people, right? Millions of people are worshiping God today, are serving Christ, and in a place of serving today and worshiping as a result of a handful of people over 2,000 years ago that did what? They carried it on beyond them, right? They shared the faith, and they went out and shared and took risk and shared the gospel, and as a result, we were able to see lives changed, and even today, us being here and lives changed. In Psalms 112, I want to give you a verse here. It's the New Living Translation. You can write it down. I'll give you a couple of different verses. And like I said, this is an interesting setup for the next couple of weeks, but I want to be able to set this up for us this morning as we make preparations. And so in the second part of the first verse, it says this: how joyful are those who fear the Lord and delight in obeying his commands. Verse 2, the children will be what? Say that word. Successful. Where will they be successful? Everywhere. An entire generation of godly people will be what? Will be blessed. Now, before we move on to the next verse, I want you to look at this. It says here that their children will be successful. Let me ask you a question. What is successful in your eyes? What's considered success for your kids? Is it education? Well, that's important, right? Is it health, that they're healthy, taking care, making sure they're taking care of their bodies? What's considered, what do you value as success? We can be successful, but yet if our children are not Christ followers, we failed. We can be successful with wealth and possessions, but yet if we're not imparting godly values on the next generation, we failed. And so what is success, right? Where there's no vision, people what? Perish. So what is success? What are you setting up success for your kids? What are you preparing them for? And so as we look at this for just a moment, I want you to see this, from the eyes as a parent or as a grandparent or family or one day to be parents, as a child, but also as a leader in the community, because I think it's going to apply to all of us. And so to listen to this, and even for the next couple of weeks as we set this up and we identify and look at this together. But here's what we know. According to historians, according to sociologists, here's what they say, that it is very difficult to pass something from one generation to the third generation. It's very difficult to be able to take something from one generation and go to the second generation and then to the third generation. How many of you have ever played the game where you're in a circle? We did this in youth group a lot, where you get in a circle and you tell a secret, you tell them to tell the secret, they tell the secret, and it goes all the way around back to the other side, and then it gets to the very last person and they say it out loud, and it has nothing to do with who started the secret. Has anybody ever played that game before as a child maybe? Or right? It's crazy. Well, they say that it's very difficult to go from one generation to the third generation. It's difficult to pass wealth. It's difficult to pass your faith on. It's difficult to pass your values. It's very difficult to pass a business on, and et cetera. All of those things, it's very difficult. In fact, Harvard Business Review wrote this. They said that only 10% of businesses will make it from the first generation to the third. Only 10% will make it from the first generation to the third. They say that the first generation starts it, the second generation will run it, and by the third generation they ruin it as it moves on. They say the first generation is marked with a couple of characteristics. One is strong leadership. Entrepreneurial, right? Going out and taking the risk and seeing the rewards from it. It's often marked by economic prosperity or intellectual progress. They're developing, they're growing. There's spiritual growth there that we find in development. The first generation takes the risk and they see the rewards. But here's what we find with the second generation. Here's what happens. The gears change a little bit. They inherit something that they appreciate, but they did not earn it. They inherit something that's been given to them, but yet they did not create it. And so things change. Because they value it, but yet they didn't earn it, they don't know how to recreate it. They don't know how to get there. And as a result, their goal is to what? Is to protect it. And so they move into a mode of protection, and it's a very good motive. They want to protect those values. They want to protect what's there. And so they move into an attitude of preservation, right? They want to save it. And so instead of taking the risk, they're more of holding back. And they're protecting. And suddenly there's a loss of drive or motivation. There's a loss of an appetite for taking risk. And because they value it, but they didn't earn it, they simply try to protect it. And then here's where they say with sociologists how that moves from the first, second to the third. Here's where the third generation lands. They come along, and all they have seen is someone protecting something. And they begin to say, this is not very inspiring, just to watch them protect. And suddenly they have no vision for something greater, no cause beyond themselves. And they often reject the values of those who have gone on before them. And that third generation is often therefore marked by a decline in growth, a decline in strength and preservation, a decline all the way around, and you see it again and again. And I don't have time this morning, but we could go through Old Testament story after Old Testament story of families and watch how from one generation to the next things transition and things change, right? And how that works. You could take Moses, right? Leads them right up, to the land. You got Joshua there, the commander in battle in the Old Testament. Leads them into the promised land. He's strong. He's bold. He walks them in. He's a strong leader, and there's risk, and there's reward, and and there's failures that can be there as well, but he's willing to take the risk. Let's go conquer it. Let's go do this, right? He's very bold, and he's a strong and courageous leader. What happens to the second generation? They inherit those things, right? They inherit the promised land. So what do they want to do? They want to protect what they have. They go into protection mode, and there's a few problems along the way, but what we find with them is their worship is half-hearted, right? They're not fully trusting. They're not fully worshiping and surrendering everything. It's kind of a half-hearted thing in the way that they live their lives and the way that they worship. And as a result of half-hearted worship, right? We actually talked about this a few weeks ago. It's a very dangerous thing just to give our kids a little bit of God, right? Because if we expose them to just a little bit and teach them that's all they need, then they never get exposed to the full gospel and all of His glory and all of His power and His love and grace. And so we need to expose them to the entire gospel. Well, we find that here with the second generation being half-hearted in their worship, passing to the third generation, and what they've seen is preservation and half-hearted worship. So what happens in the third generation? Why do we even worship this God anyway? Why are we even here? And they turn away from God, and by the end of the third generation, they have identity struggles with who they are. We find that in Judges, by the way. Judges 21:25. In those days, we're talking about the third generation, what I just mentioned. In those days, Israel had no what? No king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. It's the third generation. It's the issue of moving from the first to the second to the third. And so I believe I want to share this with you this morning. I believe that God calls us all to view our life as the first generation, to view our life as one that takes risk in our faith, and to move forward, to view our life and see that we need to pass that on. We need to be bold and courageous and do those things and continually pass on that first generation mindset. Now, it is important to protect those values, but we can't move into a defensive mode where we forget to have offense and move forward. It takes both to be able to operate, right? And so the three things I want to mention to you about transition and about making preparations with our families and with our kids as parents and as grandparents, and also in our businesses, there's a couple of mistakes that we make. There's a couple of challenges there. I was telling my wife this morning, I said, baby, I know you're serving in Journeytown today, but if you go back during the week and you hear this message, I'm not preaching at you, I promise. And she's like, well, what are you preaching? So I go to tell her, she's like, oh, you're in that category too. You just preaching to yourself, right? So when I share this with you, these are things that even we have to guard in our own heart, right? These are things Brittany's like, oh, no, you're right there in you're in that basket with me. And I am. You know, those are things just as parents that we struggle with. And so I want to give you a couple of those. And like I said, everything I'm going to share, some of you are going to be elbow and some of you are going to be going, I told you so. You know, don't do all that, right? I'm just preparing you for what I'm about to say and then to tell you that you need to be back for the next few weeks. All right? So go ahead and make the commitment to be here for the next few weeks, to sign up for this, to be able to hear what it looks like when we say yes to the next generation and we are making preparations. But I want us to look at these because we all make these mistakes, okay? We all do this as parents because we're in a different place. And so we have to guard ourselves here. So number one is this. Take notes. Write these down. Take a deep breath. It's okay. Here we go, right? Number one is this. We're not willing to take the risk. One of the challenges that you're going to face is you're not willing to take the risk. You're not willing to do what you need to do. Now, some of you are about to be very shocked. Some of you are not going to believe this. Some of you are just, your mind's going to, if you're young, if you're under 20, your mind's about to be blown for a minute, okay? So let's take a couple of surveys here. How many of you in here that's here, and those of you can talk about it that are watching online, whether you're traveling and listening or whatever, you can talk about it in the car. Let me ask you a question. How many of you in here, when you were young, you actually, at some point in your life, you walked to school? Raise your hand. All right, there's a few hands in here. All right, put your hand down. How many of you say, I walked at least half a mile to school one way? Raise your hand. All right, as the hands go up, it's some of us that are older, right? We go down. All right, how many of you say, I walked at least 1 mile to school? Raise your hand. All right, in the snow, uphill both ways, right? I get, I've heard those stories. Son, I walked in the snow. I'm like, not in South Georgia, no. But you get it, right? Complete different place. Completely different. Let me ask you another one. This is another interesting one. I want to see some hands on this one. How many of you have ever jumped off of a high dive? Raise your hand. All right, back in the 70s, right, you could go to the community pool and they would have a high dive, baby. Everybody was jumping off that thing. Now you go and stay in a hotel and there's not even a diving board there. Some of you are like, what is a diving board? I mean, they're not there because of the risk, because of the liabilities and people can get hurt. But some of you remember those things. Let me ask you another one. How many of you have ever had the opportunity, hey, you can go in the neighborhood where I remember as a kid, the boundary was the 4-lane highway. You stay on this side of the 4-lane highway, and any of that you want to cover, you go ahead, right? How many of you were able to roam the neighborhood on your own with no cell phone to get connected with? Raise your hand. Now, some of you kids are like, what? Like, I can't leave the yard without a phone. I mean, really? You were able to travel around with no phone? How many of you rode in the back of a truck when you were younger? Raise your hand. All right. How many of you remember as a kid being able to just hang out in the front seat or lay on the floorboard or whatever you want to do? Right? Times have changed a lot. What happens now? Playgrounds are getting taken away because people might get hurt. Teachers can't use red pens because it might psychologically mess the kid up. I mean, it's just completely different, right? Things have changed. We want to assure that no child ever loses, so everybody gets a trophy. You're like, come on, Benji. I'm just being honest. Things have changed completely. And I'm not saying that some of those changes are bad, or I'm just saying things are different in our culture. This weekend, we had a crazy weekend, and we were traveling, and Bentley had this pageant thing. And just a couple of weeks ago, I told Brittany, I said, Bentley needs to lose a pageant. And Brittany was like, do what? And I said, no, really, listen, she needs to lose. I said, because she's only been in a couple, and she won them. And I said, she needs to lose. I said, I don't want her to get older, and like the first time she loses, it's like a big scene. I don't want that to happen. Like, I'd rather her go ahead and lose now, and let's get that out of her system. The boys, they played sports. They know what losing's like with daddy, right? I mean, they get that. But Bentley is like, I was like, she needs to lose. So anyway, we went to a pageant yesterday, and I traveled and went with them, and we get there. And in my mind, I'm thinking, this would be a good time to lose, just get that out of our system. And I know you're like, you're a bad dad. Like, what in the world? You're not wanting your daughter to win. But hear me out. So I'm sitting there on the second row, and I'm like, yeah, this would be a good time maybe just to get that out of our system, right? Well, they go call the names, and they go through, and they go through the crowns, and she doesn't get called for any crown. And I'm like, okay, this is it, but this is the only one she can lose, right? The rest of them she can win. Now she's got the loss in, so she can win the rest. I mean, at that moment, my heart and I'm like, how is she going to respond? And you can see her just looking at the kids who won, and she's just sitting there. And my heart's like, I'm going to have to talk to her. She'll be okay, So anyway, we get off stage, and I'm like, all right, baby, I'm so proud of you. Let's get in the car. Let's get out of here. Let's go, right? Let's get back to Tifton. I was ready to go. And she says, yeah, but Daddy, I won. And I looked at her. I said, you didn't win. She's like, no, Daddy, I won. I said, well, how did you win? She said, because I did my best. And she said, that's what we've taught. That's what we've taught them. You just do your best. In basketball, whatever. You may not score the most points. Just do your best. And she said, but Daddy, I won. You told me I just do my best. And I said, you're exactly right. You did your best. We often learn more from our losses than we do our victories. It's important to lose. It's important to know what that feels like. It's important to experience that. And some of you are like, look, I've been losing enough. I'm ready to win something. I get that. But we can learn. But if we continue to protect them from failing, then what will happen is they'll have a fear of normal things in life. We have to guard against that. Professors are saying that more students today are afraid to fill out applications because they're afraid they might mess up on them. They're afraid to go to interviews because they're afraid they may not get it. We have more teenagers today that are turning 16 that have a less of a desire to drive. Why? Because they're afraid of some of those things. We've set them up in such a way. And I get it. But there has to be a balance, right? I mean, and I've heard about this. I don't promote this, but I have heard about it like from years ago. You go from people that were crazy back in the day, and some of you may be in that category, and I'm sorry I called you crazy. But you go hearing people like car surf and like crazy stuff back in the day, and now we send our kids to the mailbox and we got to put on a helmet and knee pads, right? I mean, we're trying to set them up and protect them. They're in the yard 5 minutes, and Brittany's like, hey, I don't hear them. Go look. See if you. It's completely different. Some of you heard this when you were younger. I don't think I ever really heard this. How many of you have ever told just be home by what? Dark. How many of you ever got that? Good night. I mean, that's completely different than where we are today. But I think when we don't teach our kids to take risk, as a Christ follower, to share our faith, to be bold, we're setting them up for failure. We're setting them up to be in a protection mode and not a risk-taking mode, to live out their faith. Number 2 is this, very quickly. Now, this one's a hard one. Some of you moms, don't come after me, okay? We come to the rescue too soon. Now, some of you dads don't throw no elbows. But this is for us too. There's a danger in going to the rescue too quick. Some of you can identify with it, right? Your child forgets about their science project. And what happens? Mom goes and buys all the supplies and is up till 2 a.m. helping make it happen, right? We're going to be sure they get past that. We've all been guilty of that. Or your child forgets their lunch money. And so you take off work and have to travel 45 minutes in order to get them, instead of letting them go one day without a meal at lunch. You're like, you would do that, Dad? I mean, come on. But, to let them, hey, you got to have responsibility. I'll never forget elementary school. Mr. Hobbs was his name. And I got in trouble. Of course, it wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything wrong, but I got in trouble. And I got called to the office, and Mr. Hobbs said, I'm going to call your papa. And it's in one of those moments you're thankful that cell phones aren't around yet, right? I mean, you're like, Lord, don't let him be at work. Don't let him answer the phone at work, And he calls, and then he answers, and I hear him say hello, and I'm going, okay, he's my ambassador. He loves me. He's going to speak. He's going to protect me here. And I remember Mr. Hobbs saying, hey, your son's in trouble. Here's what he's done. We feel like, we could spank him, and he'll, this will be a lesson for him. And I could hear him through the phone. He said, you do whatever you need to do, and then I'll do the same when he gets home. That was my one time. That was my one time, right? I learned from that. Now, I want you to hear, again, I'm not saying that this is the way to solve the problems, but here's what I am telling you. We can't rescue them too soon. How many of you can remember times when your parents didn't come to the rescue, right? It's important to learn from our failures and our mistakes. 85%, they say that 85% of those under the age of 32 will move back home at least once after they finish college. 85%. Imagine this. Son runs away. They spend all of their money, all of their earnings, all of everything that you've given them, their inheritance, on parties, lavish events, clothes, friends, throwing their life away. And you're from a distance watching. What do you do? I've been in many conversations, and it's been with some families in here, whether it's been in the evenings or in early mornings at a restaurant or in other places, talking with people who are struggling with things, whether it's addictions to alcohol or drugs, and they can't get their life together, or whatever it may be. And the family member's like, this is my son, and I love him, and I want what's best for him. Will you talk to him? And it's hard to rescue someone who doesn't feel like they need rescuing. Sometimes you have to allow people to hit a certain place before you can help them get back up. And as a parent or a grandparent or a sibling, it's hard. But we can't come to the rescue too often. That story I just told you is a biblical story, right? The prodigal son. Did the father go rescue him? He allowed him to experience failure. He allowed him to experience some pain. He allowed him to realize that he blew it and that he was living with the pigs and he was in bad shape. The father loved him enough not to rescue him, so the son would come to realize the natural consequences of his sin. And he would come to his senses and say, this is no way for me to live. And that can be hard as parents, right? We want to rescue our kids. We're protecting the future generation from the natural consequences of bad decisions. And it's important that we allow them to experience some of those things, because if we don't, we're making them handicapped for the future and how they respond and how they live. And that can be hard, but when we try to protect them, it's actually hurting them in some ways. And then the last one is this. We provide rewards too often. And I'm going to go back through these this weekend, or the next couple of weeks, and we'll look at this together. But we provide rewards too often. We oftentimes give things that they didn't earn. You know, we provide allowances when they're 5 and 6 and 7 years old, when they haven't even participated in any chores. We just give them allowances. Or we allow them to spend the $100 on a pair of shoes when they're 8 years old or 9 years old, right? Or we give them the cell phone when they're 12. Or provide the vehicle for them when they turn 15, waiting on 16. I mean, listen, I mean, and I'm not saying some of those things if you're able to provide it in a way and they're able, but I'm telling you, but some of those things we have to guard because we can reward too often, and they have no chores at home, and they've never earned $1 on their own, and it's entirely unfair to them because we're setting them up for life to tell them that it's easy. And the first time it gets hard, what do? They quit. They stop. They need to experience some of those things. But we as parents, me included here, right? We end up bowing down to the altar in our culture of happiness. And we want to make sure our kids are what? Happy. Are they happy where they're at? Do they have friends? Are they happy? Do they fit in because other kids have things that they don't? Are they happy? And we completely miss it. We bow down to that word, happiness. And so, hey, if I go get in debt, it'll make me happy because I'm going to get this thing that I want. Or, hey, for better, for worse, right? We get married for better, for worse, but later on, well, I'll continue the better for worse, but you got to make me what? Happy. I got to stay happy. I'm not happy anymore. We start threatening to leave because we're not happy. Because happy is where we want to be. You know, God even said it, right? Be happy because I'm happy. Is that what he said? No, he said be what? Holy, because I'm holy. And so if I had someone different in my relationship, I'd be happy. If I had more money, then I would be happy. If I had more power and more authority in my job, I'd be happy. If I had more popularity and people knew me, I would be happy. If I had more social networking friends, I would be happy. Take a moment and write this down. It's a long phrase, or you can get your phone out and take a picture of it. But I want to put this on the screen. Stop being concerned with my child being happy today, and start being concerned with my child being ready for tomorrow. When will we stop being concerned if my child is happy today and start being concerned with them being ready for tomorrow? Happiness is a byproduct of being fulfilled. And if we're fulfilled in life as a Christ follower, happiness will come along with that. But if all we're consumed with is happiness, we completely miss the plan of making them ready and prepared for the future, prepared for failures, prepared for those things that they're gonna face. Happiness is not the end goal. It's a byproduct of the fulfilled life in Christ, right? And so how do we do that? Look to somebody beside you and say, that's a good question. I'm still working on it, right? How do we make that? How do we prepare the next generation? How do I prepare for these things to go to my kids? Because ultimately, I was telling someone at the first service that came and was sharing some struggles, I said, ultimately, we do these things, but then also there's a part on the kid. They have to receive it, right? They still have their own life, and they can choose to follow it, or they may rebel. And we can't force them into things, but we can love them and lead them and teach them along the way. But how do we make preparations to at least prepare them to know that we've done what we need to do to prepare them so that it can pass on to the following generations with our faith, and our values and our risk-taking as visionaries and being willing to go out and conquer and do the things that God calls us to do? Go back to those first couple of verses at the very beginning that is found in Psalms. How joyful are those who fear the Lord and delight in obeying His commands. Their children will be, there's that word, successful everywhere. An entire generation of godly people will be blessed. An entire generation. Let's go to the next verse. They themselves will be wealthy, and their good deeds will last forever. There's 3 words right here. They are what? Generous, compassionate, and what? Righteous. If you want to know what we're going to be looking at the next couple of weeks, there you go. They were generous, compassionate, and righteous. And look at that last one with me. What's that last part say? Those who are righteous will be what? Long what? Remembered. Those who are righteous will be long remembered. What happens when your life is finished? My prayer is that it'll be long remembered by your generosity, by your compassion, and by the righteousness of God living in your life. And may we impart those things on our kids to teach them to be the first generation every time, to take the risk, to realize they're going to lose, to realize they're going to win some and they are going to lose some, to realize that there's going to be failures, to realize sometimes they'll be rewarded, sometimes they won't. But to make preparations for them to live the life that God has for them and know that ultimately our reward is found in Christ and what He provides for us and in us and through us as Christ followers. And 1 Chronicles, the last verse, and we'll be finished. Verse 28, 9 and 10 says, And Solomon, my son, learn to know the God of your ancestors intimately. Right? Looking back on the generations, making preparations for the future. To remember to know the God of your ancestors intimately. Worship and serve Him with your whole heart and a will and mind. For the Lord sees every what? Heart. Everyone here right now, the Lord sees your heart. And He knows every what? Plan and thought that you have. Every plan, every thought, He knows your heart. He knows it all. If you seek Him, you will find Him. In verse 10, it goes on and says, So take this what? Seriously. The Lord has chosen you to build a temple that is a sanctuary. And then He goes on and says here, Be strong and what? Do the work. Look to somebody beside you and say, Do the work. Hey, as a leader, do the work. As a parent, do the work. Make preparations. Have vision. Talk about those things with your family. Say yes to the next generation. And by saying yes, it means you got to do the work. You got to do something. Be here the next couple of weeks as we look at this together. As we take that journey together and talk about what it means to do the work, to say yes, to prepare from one generation to the next, with every head bowed. And I close. Father, I pray for every individual that's represented here. Lord, I pray that you would speak to their hearts. Lord, I pray that their families would be challenged and motivated, God, to live for you. Lord, I pray that we would say yes. Lord, for some right now in this place, that they would be willing to say yes to salvation, to say yes to forgiveness, to say yes to your grace, and to say yes to the life change that you provide. It only comes from you. As they surrender their heart, they surrender their life, as they're convicted of their sins and they know they need life change, that's where the yes would start for them. For others, Lord, I pray as parents and as grandparents and leaders, Lord, that we would be willing to say yes to the next generation and make an impact, not just to be selfish with what we want in life, but we would be setting up for the next generation. That we would teach the values and teach about what it means to take those risks in you, Father, and be bold in their faith. And be willing to walk the journey that you call us to walk in faith. To protect what we love, but also to be willing to be on the offensive side and continue to move forward and advance the gospel. Help us to pass it on. Lord, help us to live our lives in such a way as righteous people that will be long remembered. And that we'll be able to celebrate one day when this life is over in eternity as Christ followers and be able to rejoice together in heaven. Father, we thank you for your amazing grace. We thank you for that forgiveness and that love that you've extended to us. Help us to extend it to our families and our friends. and to love like you have loved us. Help us to lead in such a way that we make preparation for eternity. For us in Jesus' name alone we pray, and we all say together, amen. Let's stand to our feet.